We're talking November 6th, 1990, deep in the wilds of Ukraine, where the kind of nightmare most folks couldn't even dream up was unfolding. A 22-year-old woman, Svetlana, or as they called her, Sveta, got dragged into the abyss that day. She was pulled right out of her reality, lured like prey by some shadow lurking in the disguise of a man. Now, we don't know exactly what bait this predator used, but the guy had a pattern, a sick, manipulative routine. Maybe he dangled promises of food, some treat, or whispered filth about trading something for favors. Whatever the hook was, it sunk deep. Sveta followed him into the forest near Donleskaz station, and that forest became her graveyard. Out there, away from any witnesses, things turned savage. Sveta wasn't just murdered. No, this was ritualistic madness. The monster attacked her, beating and stabbing her until life slipped away. But he wasn't done. This was a man who feasted on chaos, literally. He carved the tip of her tongue clean off, hacked away her private parts, and then, brace yourself, he ate them right there in the dirt, in the silence of those godforsaken woods. When he'd had his fill of this twisted ceremonial meal, he didn't even bother with decency. No burial, no ceremony. Just shoved some leaves and branches over her body like it was trash he needed to hide. Then, as casually as if he were heading home from a stroll, he marched back to the train station like nothing had happened. Picture this. A man stands by a well near a train station, scrubbing his hands and shoes like he's got something to hide. An undercover officer spots him. The guy walks past, wiping sweat off his forehead, but there's a smear of blood on his cheek, a tiny detail that speaks volumes. His coat's a mess, with grass and dirt caked on the elbows. Suspicious? You bet. The officer doesn't let it slide. He stops the man, checks his ID, and takes his details for a report. That man was Andrei Chikatilo, age 54. Fast forward to November 13th. Sveta's body is discovered in the woods. Police scour every report from the train station, digging through the logs of anyone who'd been questioned recently. One name jumps out, Chikatilo. He wasn't just a random drifter. This guy had history. He'd already been flagged as a suspect in 1984 and 1987. But now, things start to click. Police link him to other murders across the years, uncovering a trail of carnage and a questionable work history. The noose tightens. Surveillance on Chikatilo begins on November 14th. Then comes November 20th, 1990. Chikatilo leaves work early, his finger throbbing from a bite wound one of his victims inflicted. He stops at a clinic, gets an X-ray, and learns it's broken. No big deal, right? Wrong. After heading home, he decides to step out to grab some booze. Only, this wasn't just a liquor run. This guy's out there prowling, making creepy attempts to lure young boys. But luck runs out when 3 undercover officers catch him in the act. They move in and arrest him. Now, here's the kicker. Chikatilo wasn't just grabbing a drink. He had his briefcase with him and what was inside: a knife, some rope, and Vaseline. Let that sink in. The man they arrested? He'd go on to confess to butchering over 50 people, boys, girls, women, all between the ages of 9 and 45. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo came into this world on October 16, 1936, in Yablochnoye, USSR, a time and place where survival was a daily battle. Ukraine, known as the Soviet Union's breadbasket, wasn't teeming with food as the name suggests. Instead, it was a land ravaged by Stalin's agricultural collectivization. This policy forced farmers to surrender their entire harvests for redistribution, plunging the region into famine. The result? Millions starved to death. Desperation drove people to unspeakable acts, including cannibalism. Chikatilo's own mother once told him a horrifying story. His older brother Stefan had vanished years earlier, allegedly eaten by their starving neighbors. While this claim can't be verified, it became a dark cornerstone of Chikatilo's understanding of the world, and perhaps his own gruesome inclinations. By the time Chikatilo was born, the famine's shadow still loomed, leaving his childhood marked by extreme deprivation. Adding to his struggles, he was reportedly born with hydrocephalus, a condition that caused issues with his genitalia and urinary tract. As a result, he wet the bed well into his teenage years, a source of deep embarrassment and shame. Despite his grim surroundings, young Andrei found solace in books. His favorite subject? stories about German prisoners captured and tortured by the Soviet Union during World War II, a chilling interest that perhaps hinted at the man he would become. This twisted turn in Chikatilo's life came with a dark revelation. He stumbled upon something that would shape his future, a sick realization that fear and violence aroused him more than intimacy itself. The rush of control, the terror in another's eyes, became his ultimate thrill. At 18, Chikatilo aimed for something better. He applied to Moscow State University, but his dreams crashed when he failed the entrance exams. He blamed the rejection on his father's shameful war record, though it's unclear if that was true. By 1957, duty called, and Chikatilo began his mandatory military service, completing 18 months before settling near Rostov in Russia. He started working as a telephone engineer, but life remained bleak. His younger sister, seeing his struggles with women, decided to intervene. In 1962, she introduced him to Faina, a classic meet cute, though anything but romantic in hindsight. By 1963, they were married, but trouble loomed early on. Faina noticed his lack of interest in intimacy and his inability to maintain an erection during their rare encounters. Despite these issues, they somehow managed to have 2 children, a daughter, Lyudmila, in 1965, and a son, Yuri, in 1969. Chikatilo didn't stop there. In 1970, he enrolled in Rostov Liberal Arts University, earning degrees in Russian literature, engineering, and Marxism-Leninism. By 1971, he landed a job at vocational school number 32 in Novoshakhtinsk, where his life took another sinister turn. His crippling shyness made him a poor teacher. Students and staff ridiculed him relentlessly. But beneath his timid demeanor was a far darker truth. Chikatilo admitted later that he found being around children sexually exciting. His behavior reflected this twisted attraction. He lurked near bathrooms, assaulted students of both genders, and created an atmosphere of fear. By 1972, complaints from outraged parents piled up. Chikatilo's actions couldn't be ignored any longer. Forced out of his position, he left behind a trail of broken trust and trauma, a prelude to the horrors that would follow. Chikatilo got a job at a school, put in charge of the boys' dorm. His charges didn't listen to him, frequently teased him. One night, Chikatilo was caught trying to perform illegal things on a sleeping young boy. The senior students who caught him attacked and beat him up. Chikatilo decided to start carrying a knife for protection, instead of just not doing that anymore. In 1978, Chikatilo and his family moved to Shakhty, restarted his killing spree. On December 22, 1978, he killed 9-year-old Lena Zekathora. Her body was found 2 days later. Chikatilo was questioned, but released when his wife provided an alibi, saying he was home all evening. Someone had to be blamed, and the police were known for getting confessions by any means. They brought in 25-year-old Alexander Kravchenko, who had a previous rape conviction from 1970. Kravchenko confessed, was arrested, tried, and convicted for Lena's murder. He was sentenced to death, executed in 1984. Between 1978 and 1981, Chikatilo kept a low profile. No murders were tied to him during this period, and he remained invisible to law enforcement. But in 1981, life took a turn. He was made redundant at the mining school where he worked. Complaints from his past made it impossible to secure another teaching job. Left with few options, Chikatilo found work as a clerk at a raw materials factory in Rostov. This position required frequent travel, effectively expanding his hunting ground. On September 3, 1981, his reign of terror resumed. Chikatilo crossed paths with 17-year-old Larisa Tkachenko. He lured her to a secluded area, gagged her with dirt and leaves to silence her screams, and unleashed his sadistic urges. Larisa was strangled and stabbed to death in an explosion of violence that gave Chikatilo the release he craved. With his new job providing ample opportunities, Chikatilo began targeting young runaways he encountered at bus stops and train stations. He persuaded them to follow him into the woods, where the horror would unfold. His attacks followed a sickening pattern: attempted assault, brutal violence, and, disturbingly, cannibalism. Chikatilo often ate the reproductive organs of his victims and sometimes mutilated their bodies further, taking parts like the tip of a nose or tongue as macabre trophies. One particularly unsettling detail was his treatment of his early victims' eyes. He would mutilate or remove them entirely, driven by a bizarre belief that the eyes retained an imprint of his face even in death. For Chikatilo, each act of depravity fed his insatiable hunger for dominance and destruction, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable suffering. Between 1978 and 1981, Chikatilo kept a low profile. No murders were tied to him during this period, and he remained invisible to law enforcement. But in 1981, life took a turn. He was made redundant at the mining school where he worked. Complaints from his past made it impossible to secure another teaching job. Left with few options, Chikatilo found work as a clerk at a raw materials factory in Rostov. This position required frequent travel, effectively expanding his hunting ground. In the Soviet Union during this period, the concept of serial killers wasn't just unfamiliar, it was outright dismissed. The regime had a habit of suppressing anything that could stir public panic or disrupt the image of societal control. But Chikatilo's signature act of mutilating his victim's eyes was too distinct to ignore. Investigators reluctantly admitted they were dealing with a serial killer, an acknowledgement that was more palatable than the alternative. Rumors had begun to swirl, ranging from foreign conspiracies to full-blown werewolf attacks. The truth, grim as it was, offered at least some clarity to a frightened public. On June 12, 1982, Chikatilo claimed his third victim, 13-year-old Lyuba Biryuk. He lured her, attempted to rape her, and, when that failed, unleashed his rage. Lyuba was stabbed repeatedly, and her eyes were slashed in his grotesque ritual. Her body was discovered 2 weeks later, already skeletal from exposure to the harsh summer elements. Then came an inexplicable lull in his killing spree. No one knows why he stopped, but by June 1983, Chikatilo was back at it, murdering 15-year-old Laura Sarkisyan. The violence continued with chilling regularity. Summer 1983, an unidentified woman estimated to be between 18 to 25 years old. September 1983, 22-year-old Valentina Choetjoelina. October 27, 1983, 19-year-old Vera Shevkun. December 27, 1983, 14-year-old Sergei Markov. By the end of 1983, Chikatilo had claimed 17 victims, though only 6 bodies had been recovered. The string of disappearances had Moscow militia on edge. Detective Major Mikhail Fetisov was handed the case and sent to Rostov to clean up the mess. When Fetisov reviewed the local police's so-called investigation, he was furious. He fired off a blistering report to his superiors, ripping into the local force for their incompetence. More importantly, he put forth a theory. All 6 murders were connected, carried out by a single, sexually motivated killer. After some hesitation, headquarters begrudgingly admitted he might be right. By 1984, the gruesome crimes had earned a nickname, Lesopolosa, or Forest Strip Killings. Forensics back then weren't exactly cutting edge, but semen samples from the scenes revealed that the perpetrator had type AB blood. Useful, sure. Identifiable, not even close. And with nothing stopping him, Chikatilo had a field day in 1984, leaving behind a staggering 15 more victims. On September 13, 1984, undercover officers patrolling a train station spotted a man in a fur hat prowling the platform. He was sidling up to young women, acting shady as hell. Then, as if he couldn't help himself, he groped a hooker. That was it. They pounced and arrested him for public lewdness. When they searched his briefcase, they found a knife. Things got even sketchier when they took a blood sample and started digging into his history. Turns out, this wasn't just some creep with a blade. This guy had a long track record of peeping on girls in dorms and assaulting students at the schools where he worked. So, when Chikatilo's blood type came back as type A, they assumed they had the wrong guy. Their samples pointed to someone with type AB blood, and they thought the case was closed. What they didn't realize was that Chikatilo belonged to a rare group known as non-secretors. For people like him, saliva, sperm, and other fluids test as type AB, but his actual blood showed up as type A. The B antigens in his blood were too scarce to register. If they'd tested anything other than his blood, they would have nailed him as type AB and locked him away. Instead, the police had to settle for nabbing him on theft charges from his last job. He was sentenced to a year in prison, but only served 3 months. On December 12, 1984, Andrei Chikatilo was back on the streets. Getting out of jail didn't signal a transformation for Andrei Chikatilo. If anything, it meant he was ready to dive back into his twisted routine. Prison had been nothing more than a brief intermission for the man with a murderous appetite. By December, newly released, Chikatilo secured a job at a locomotive factory. The position conveniently allowed him to travel, giving him access to fresh hunting grounds. In 1985, the search for the elusive killer took a new direction. The head of Moscow's Department of Violent Crime, grimly nicknamed the Killer Department, stepped in and revamped the entire investigation. This overhaul saw officers deployed in organized teams to monitor key train stations. Shakhty, Rostov, and Novoshakhtinsk were each assigned squads of uniformed police officers tasked with stopping and questioning suspicious individuals. Meanwhile, plainclothes detectives infiltrated smaller stations, quietly observing the crowd and reporting any unusual behavior. On August 1st, during a work trip, Chikatilo crossed paths with 18-year-old Natalia Pokilstova. She became his next victim. Later that month, on August 27th, he struck again, targeting another 18-year-old, Irina Guliayeva. By December, however, Chikatilo's hunting grounds were crawling with police. Major train hubs were under constant surveillance, and military helicopters patrolled the skies, scanning railways and surrounding forests for any sign of trouble. Chikatilo was both frightened and cunning. He pressed pause on his spree, shifting his focus to something unexpected, assisting the very investigation that was hunting him. Like any calculated predator, he wormed his way into the operation, helping the militia patrol trains in search of the phantom killer terrorizing the region. Officially labeled as a freelance employee of the Department of Internal Affairs, Chikatilo had a front-row seat to the investigation. This insider access gave him a clear understanding of where the police were focused, effectively limiting his ability to kill in those areas, for now. What happened in 1986 remains a mystery. No victims were officially linked to him during that year. Did he genuinely take a break, knowing the authorities were everywhere? Or did he find new hunting grounds where his crimes went undiscovered? It's anyone's guess. As far as records show, 1986 passed without bloodshed, marking Chikatilo's 50th birthday with eerie silence. To the investigators, this sudden halt in murders was baffling. Someone this compulsive couldn't simply stop. They theorized he might have been arrested for an unrelated crime, relocated, or even died. But their hope for resolution was shattered in 1987. By spring, the killing machine was back in action. On May 16, 1987, Chikatilo claimed his 35th known victim, 13-year-old Oleg Makarenkov. Just 2 months later, on July 29th, 12-year-old Ivan Bilovetsky fell prey to his savagery. The attack on Ivan was so frenzied that Chikatilo's knife blade snapped, leaving the broken piece embedded in the boy's body. A grim discovery that would later be made by investigators. Andrei Chikatilo's depravity showed no signs of slowing, and his focus began to shift more toward targeting boys. On September 15, 1987, he claimed 16-year-old Yuri Tereshonok as his next victim. In April 1988, his brutality extended to an unidentified young woman estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old. May 14, 1988, saw the murder of 9-year-old Alexei Voronko. Then, on July 14, 1988, he took the life of 15-year-old Yevgeny Muratov. In March 1989, Chikatilo lured 16-year-old Tatyana Ryzhova to his daughter's former apartment. His daughter, amidst a divorce, had moved back in with her parents, leaving the apartment vacant, a grim opportunity Chikatilo seized repeatedly. Promising Tatyana alcohol, he attempted to seduce her. When he failed to perform, his rage took over. He stabbed her, and realizing he couldn't leave the body there, he resorted to a grotesque solution. Using a kitchen knife, he decapitated her and severed her arms and legs. Wrapping the dismembered parts in rags and clothing, Chikatilo tied the bundles to a neighbor's sled and brazenly dragged them through the streets until he found a secluded spot to discard her remains. On May 11, 1989, 8-year-old Alexander Dyakonov became his 42nd known victim. Just over a month later, on June 20th, 10-year-old Alexei Moiseyev met a similarly horrific fate. Then, on August 19th, 19-year-old Helena Varga crossed paths with Chikatilo on his way to his father's birthday party. He spotted her at a bus stop and offered to walk her home. Instead, he led her into the woods where his unrelenting savagery unfolded. He stabbed her repeatedly, mutilating her body by cutting out her uterus and slicing off part of her face. While Chikatilo never confessed to consuming the uterus, he disturbingly described it as pink and springy, leading investigators to suspect he had nibbled it. After wrapping her lifeless body in clothes, he continued on to his father's birthday celebration as though nothing had happened. Andrei Chikatilo's insatiable depravity continued unabated, and by the end of 1989, his gruesome tally had reached 45 known victims. His final victim of that year was 10-year-old Alexei Sobatov, marking another horrific milestone in his relentless spree. As 1989 progressed, investigators began noticing an escalation in the severity of mutilations. Victims were found with missing body parts, and his signature brutality left female victims often deprived of their uteruses and private parts, which were savagely bitten off. Male victims were not spared, with their genitals and tongues frequently bitten away. Desperate to apprehend this elusive killer, the police enlisted the expertise of psychologist Alexander Bukanovsky. His profile of the suspect starkly contrasted with earlier assumptions. Contrary to the belief that the perpetrator was a young individual, Bukanovsky painted a picture of an older man, likely between 45 and 50 years old. He described him as a socially isolated, sexually deviant individual who either lived alone or shared a home with a wife with whom he had no intimate relationship. Bukanovsky labeled the killer a necro-sadist, someone deriving sexual pleasure from the torment and deaths of others. Despite this detailed profile, Chikatilo evaded capture and continued his killing spree into the next year. On January 14, 1990, he murdered 11-year-old Andrei Kravchenko, claiming his 46th known victim. On March 7th, his savagery extended to 10-year-old Yaroslav Makarov. In April, 31-year-old Lubov Zuyeva fell prey to his heinous acts. On July 28th, he took the life of 13-year-old Viktor Petrov. August 14th marked a grim milestone when 11-year-old Ivan Fomin became Chikatilo's 50th known victim. By October 17, 1990, Chikatilo brazenly exploited a lapse in police surveillance. That night, a shortage of manpower left a railway station unpatrolled, providing him the opportunity to lure 16-year-old Vadim Gromov to his death. Gromov's mutilated body was discovered on November 3rd, bearing the horrifying hallmarks of Chikatilo's handiwork. On October 30th, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo claimed another life, 16-year-old Viktor Tishchenko. Just a week later, on November 6, 1990, he encountered 22-year-old Svetlana Sveta Korostik. Sveta would become his final victim. After savagely beating, stabbing, and mutilating her, Chikatilo returned to the train station, his suspicious demeanor catching the attention of an officer who documented his details. When Sveta's body was discovered shortly afterward, that report resurfaced, and on November 13, 1990, Chikatilo was placed under surveillance. 7 days later, while prowling for his next target, he was apprehended. Chikatilo's arrest marked the beginning of his downfall. Taken into custody at KGB headquarters, he initially remained silent, withholding any confessions. This changed when psychologist Alexander Bukanovsky intervened. Bukanovsky, who had previously profiled the killer, employed a strategy of inflating Chikatilo's fragile ego. The flattery worked, and Chikatilo began to talk. He not only confessed, but provided detailed demonstrations of his killings, using dummies in the KGB gym. Moreover, he guided investigators to crime scenes and shallow graves, uncovering bodies that the authorities had not yet discovered. In November 1990, investigators searched Chikatilo's apartment. Among the chilling discoveries were 23 knives, a hammer, and a pair of shoes that matched footprints found at a 1984 crime scene. Chikatilo confessed to at least 56 murders, though only 53 could be corroborated by evidence. Astonishingly, until his confessions, the police had only been aware of 36 victims. Despite his admissions, Chikatilo attempted to argue his mental state, claiming he was not sane during the murders. However, after a 60-day psychiatric evaluation, he was declared sane and fit to stand trial. Diagnosed with bipolar personality disorder with sadistic tendencies, his condition did not absolve him of responsibility. Authorities charged him with 52 counts of murder and 5 counts of assault. Chikatilo's trial commenced on April 14, 1992, amidst the backdrop of a newly post-Soviet Russia. The proceedings became one of the first significant legal events in the country's new era, drawing immense public and media attention. Chikatilo, unlike most defendants, didn't sit at the defense table with his lawyers. Due to the grieving families wanting blood and the very powerful emotions that were seen, it was thought that Andrei Chikatilo might be safer locked in an iron cage during the proceedings. So, Chikatilo sat in a little jail cell in the courtroom and made a spectacle of himself throughout. He had his head shaved following procedure to protect against lice, and he was wearing clothes that had been lent to him by the jail. It was reported that he sang songs, talked gibberish, acted bored, or was completely manic. Most people thought it was all an act to make his insanity seem real. The case was massive. There were 222 casebooks used in the trial, basically a textbook for lawyers that references cases so they can refer to precedents. And it took 2 days just to read off the list of indictments. The trial lasted for 6 months, and during that, there was no shortage of places for Chikatilo and his lawyers to put the blame. They claimed that because of Stalin's agricultural collectivism, he'd grown up poor and starving. There was cannibalism in the town, and his own mother had told him that his older brother had been snatched by neighbors and eaten. They, of course, blamed his parents. His mother was called bitter and belittling, and she beat him when he wet the bed. The family lived in a one-room shack, and he shared a bed with her. One claim was that Chikatilo had witnessed something that left him damaged. According to rumors, Chikatilo, his defense, etc., while his father was a prisoner of war, Chikatilo's mom had been raped by a German soldier and gotten pregnant. This was backed up by the timeline of his baby sister's birth, as his father would have still been a prisoner of war when his mom got pregnant. Since Chikatilo and his mother shared a bed, and their shack was only one room anyway, young Andrei would have witnessed this. Then they blamed the fact that his dad was a disgraced veteran, which had caused further hardship on the family, and their hut was even burned down once. They even blamed the fact that Chikatilo claimed he couldn't see while he was in school, and it wasn't until he was 30 that he got glasses. Who do you think is to blame? Chikatilo, his father, or his mother? Until next time. En decidigo expo des